Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around I've got some more movies from Imprint and Viavision. I've got 3 of the new Imprint releases. I've got 2 releases that came from Viavision. And there is some really deep cut fun stuff here. So let's get started. Now, way back in the early days of Imprint as a label, a little movie came up called The Face Behind the Mask with Peter Lorre from 1941. A deep cut hidden gem. Was a small film. Nobody knew about it, but it's a really interesting piece of Peter Lorre's filmic career. And this first movie I've got for you in this month's bunch of Imprint releases is kind of in that same vein of a deep cut hidden gem. It only runs 64 minutes. And it was doubled up in a double feature with another movie called Valley of the Zombies, which ran 56 minutes. Between them, they make about the running time of an average feature film. But this one is kind of interesting, kind of weird. Made by Republic Pictures, a low-budget Poverty Row studio, which specialized in westerns mostly. And it's a little film called The Catman of Paris. Really nice cover art on this. I'll read you the blurb off the back. Paris, 1896. Charles Renier, recently returned from the Orient, has developed a strange illness that has left him with lapses of memory. At the same time, the city is being terrorized by the Catman, who roams the streets at night, leaving a trail of clawed, mangled bodies in his wake. So that's it. It's kind of like a cat lycanthropy thing. It stars an interesting actor called Carl Esmond, who, like many other people, including Peter Lorre, fled the Nazis in the 1930s, went to England, went to America, and had a very long film career. Carl Esmond lived to be 104 years old. So take that, Hitler. It also stars a Canadian actor called Douglas Dumbrell, playing a friend of Renier's, a guy called Henri Bouchard, who's kind of a mentor to him. And there's a little bit more to the relationship. There's a slight undercurrent there. Renier, in the meantime, has a fiancée who he's about to drop because they just aren't suited to each other. And he also has a bit of a fangirl who is the daughter of his publisher who falls in love with him. And they kind of build a relationship. So they put a lot of character bits into this short 64-minute running time. By the way, there's the inside cover, which is a really good one. I love the artwork on that one, and I love, well, the photography really, and the kind of photo montage of it works really well. The inside cover's pretty good too. That's from an old lobby card, and I like to look at that one as well. Nice quality progress. I mean, this is very much unashamedly a B picture, but it's still kind of interesting. It plays in the same way as a kind of low-budget Universal horror film does, to a certain extent. I think that may have been the intention in 1946. But it kind of plays with perspective and plays with your mind. Right over the titles, there's a really odd scene. I'll play the titles for you now while I'm talking about it, which sets you up for this in an interesting way. And there are also some really interesting uses of shadow in this movie. So obviously Jacques Tourneur was a big influence on this film, and that's not to dissuade you from watching this, because I think it's a fun addition to your collection if you are a horror movie fan. And even though it does have that short running time, and even though we have a high definition transfer from an original camera negative, unfortunately there was a bit of damage on the original camera negative, so you've got some lines down the side of the screen a bit, and there are moments where it shows the age and the lack of care that the negative have been held with. The set designs are pretty good too. They've got some really nice furnishings and the way the sets are laid out. It gives you the feel of the time. There are a few other actors in here who are kind of interesting. Gerald Moore, who later turned up in some science fiction things in the 1950s, plays a police inspector. Fritz Feld, who people know, short European character actor who did a lot of comedy things way into the 1960s and 1970s. He plays the prefect of police in there. He gets a couple of good scenes. And the movie kind of underplays an interesting twist on lycanthropy, which is more based on the 9 lives of a cat. It builds an underlying mythology, which is kind of interesting, and I really think that they buried the lead by not featuring that a little more prominently than they did. But of course, they had a short running time and a low budget. Really, if you want to see an interesting piece of 1940s programmer, as they were called, you could do worse than picking this one up, particularly if you're a horror movie buff. It's not particularly horrifying, but it does show you the kinds of movies that were enjoyed by audiences at the time. Now, the extras are pretty good. There's an audio commentary by Kim Newman and Stephen Jones, which is always a bit of fun. You get tons of trivia in those ones. There's a nice video essay by Kat Ellinger, who is just fantastic, called Mark of the Beast, Myth-Making and Masculinity in the Catman of Paris. It talks a lot about the similarities between cat people and the Catman of Paris and how each of them lays as far as their portrayal of aberrations concerned. There's also The Republic Picture Story, a feature-length documentary about the pioneering studio featuring hundreds of clips and on-camera interviews. That's from 1991. And if you are a fan of movie history, and particularly Hollywood history, getting this not only for the Catman of Paris, but getting it for the Republic story, getting a full documentary about the history of a movie studio, makes it totally worthwhile. This one delivers, even though the feature presentation, in a sense, is only 64 minutes. I like the extras, and I like the fact that it's got a full-length documentary. That's what some of these boutique labels are doing now. Where the movie itself isn't particularly long or particularly fantastic, it may be important in the film history, but it's not the best film in the world, they will backfill with some interesting documentary stuff related to the film. And I really appreciate that, because it gives you a double-barreled shotgun instead of just a single-barreled small ball gun, in a sense. And that's what they've done with Catman of Paris. So I really enjoyed that for the extras, but mostly because I like that B-picture horror stuff that doesn't get talked about anywhere near enough. That then lets us zip pan to the 1960s and 1965, where Universal was making all sorts of interesting little programmers which, from a modern context, are more interesting than they were in the 1960s. There were things like Pendulum with Gene Seberg and George Peppard. There were movies like Banning with Robert Wagner, which is one of my favourite B pictures. And there's this one which has quite a famous writer who took his name off the film because the studio ruined his film. And the movie is Bus Riley's Back in Town, with Michael Parks and Anne Margaret in it. And this one was actually written by William Inge, who did Come Back Little Sheba, which Imprint have also released. He did Picnic, he did Bus Stop, he did those kind of small town underbelly of the small town life kind of stories where there's usually a hot lust and a touch of perversion and all that kind of thing. And this one was kind of ruined by the studio, so he took his name off it. Michael Parks plays a guy called Bus Riley, who's back in town because he'd been off of the Navy for a few years. And then he finds out that his ex-girlfriend, Laurel, played by Anne Margaret, has married a wealthier, older man. So he comes back to town. He doesn't want to be a mechanic, even though he's a great mechanic. And he actually helps out at a local garage run by James Doohan from Star Trek, who only gets a couple of scenes, but yeah, James Doohan. He then tries to be a vacuum cleaner salesman for a very shonky scientific vacuum cleaner system, which he is hired by Brad Dexter, who played Harry in The Magnificent Seven. He's hired by him to work on that. When he finds out that a lot of women who get door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesmen in the front door often take them directly to the bedroom. So he finds an interesting sideline to his business there, and he's not happy with it. He starts up an affair again with Laurel, even though she's married, but she's unashamedly lusting after Bus. And there are all sorts of other minor characters. There's a younger sister played by Kim Darby, who later turned up in True Grit with John Wayne. And there's a friend of his younger sister played by Jenna Margolin, who Bus kind of likes, but not in a kind of totally lusting kind of way. And there's an interesting thing. When he comes back to town, he's been offered a job before he left for the Navy by an old friend who runs a funeral parlour, an older guy. And there's a scene where it becomes fairly obvious that what the older man wants is a live-in lover as much as he wants somebody to groom and to mentor into the business he's in. And Bus kind of knocks him back on that, but it doesn't get to that stage of homophobia where there's violence. It's just that he's kind of disappointed, and he walks out of the place not taking the job. And I like the way that's handled too. William Inge, the original writer, was gay himself, so the sensitivity with which that scene is played. And later on, when there's a funeral, Bus talks to the older guy while they're arranging the funeral arrangements after the service. And there seems to be, the friendship's been retained, even though there is that approach made by the older guy. And I kind of like the way that's handled. It's handled in a way that plays well to a modern audience. And I like those little bits of business that show that not everything was strident when it came to alternative sexualities. The movie's not great. I'll be honest with you. This movie is not the best movie in the world. It was obviously weakened by the studio, because the studio, of course, wants to put it out into the cinemas and then sell it onto television, so they didn't want to be too edgy. And it's 1965. It's just before that moment in 66, 67 when edgy became good. It's kind of neither fish nor fowl, and I think it should have been stronger than it was in some things. Michael Parks is good. Anne Margaret is underused. I think there are other movies where Anne Margaret's sensuality and her vividness is played a lot better. Things like The Swinger and The Pleasure Seekers, and also Viva Las Vegas. But anyway, here's the inside cover, which I think may be taken from a daybill poster. There are a few extras. This is a 1080p high-definition presentation of a 2K scan. There's an audio commentary with Lee Fife from Paul Strabo from 2023. And film professor Lucy Bolton on Anne Margaret and her career. So you get an Anne Margaret documentary as well. On the inside, you've got another production still there. But for me, this is the least interesting of the three, because I was watching it not really remembering that William Ince had done Picnic, the movie with Kim Novak and William Holden in it back in the late 50s. And when I was watching the movie, I thought, this feels a lot like Picnic. It's got the same character types in it. One neurotic female character in there, the lusty women, the studly men, all that kind of thing. And yeah, sure enough, same writer. But if you're interested in 1960s cinema, you'll get Bus Riley's Back in Town. But for me, it's the least of the three. Now, before I do the third one, I'm going to show you the other stuff that I got from Viavision, which has been released by them this month. And this stuff I like. A lot of people will like this. Science fiction, so the science fiction fans of the channel are going to like it. A Blu-ray release of Stargate, the movie, with the theatrical version and a director's cut. It's got 2 discs in it. So there's your original theatrical cut, and there's the extended cut there. You've got them both on Blu-ray. Released by MGM. It's got Kurt Russell, James Spader, of course. There are a lot of special features here as well. There's an audio commentary by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, the writers, producers, and directors. Deciphering the Gate concepts and casting featurette. Opening the Gate, making of the movie featurette. Passing through the Gate, the legacy. Is there a Stargate featurette? Making of Stargate documentary. Previews, B-roll footage, gag reel, theatrical trailer. Picture-in-picture Stargate Ultimate Knowledge. So there's a trivia quiz in there as well. But I know middle-aged geek girl's a big fan of Stargate. She's also got all of the series on this enormous box set down in the corner there. It's a good, honest little science fiction actioner. It's not really groundbreaking stuff, but it uses special effects well. Kurt Russell's always fun in a movie. I don't know there's a movie where Kurt Russell was in after he stopped doing Disney movies. That's not at least interesting. And also, Roland Emmerich's kind of European sensibility makes it a little different than many Hollywood movies at the time. But Stargate, it's nice to have a solid edition of this in your collection. I apologise, this is Region B. But you should have a multi-region Blu-ray player. And if you don't, ask Santa Claus at the end of the year and you may get one. With a decent release of it, with those 2 different versions and with a ton of extras on it. So, rock solid stuff. The other thing I got, which I'm going to go through, and this is another one of those cases of Saturday afternoon movies that were on TV in the 1960s and 1970s and Saturday afternoons. Audie Murphy, Man of the West Collection, number 3. I haven't got the other 2. But Viavision sent me this one. And Audie Murphy Westerns are good kind of B-Westerns. They're not gunfight at the OK Corral. They're not high noon. But they're good, honest actioners. Darren McGavin turns up in one of them too, which is pretty good. And Walter Brennan. You got The Duel at Silver Creek. a movie called Gunsmoke, which I don't know if it's related to the TV series and radio series or not. Column South, Drums Across the River, and Bullet for a Bad Man. So if you want like B-picture westerns from the 1950s, these one of them's from 64, but the rest from 1950s. There's a couple of theatrical trailers on there as well. The movies are all, fortunately, on individual discs. So they're not kind of knocking down the quality to cram things onto discs, and I appreciate that a lot. I think that that's something that we hopefully have left in the past, where movies are kind of crammed in. These are going to play to a certain audience. I'm going to watch them too. I'm putting them on the coffee table whenever I feel like a B-Western. I watch the Bud Baedeker renowned Westerns way too often. I need something else as far as Westerns are concerned. I'm going to give these ones a go. Audie Murphy was never a talented actor. Apparently he was very talented at shooting Germans, but he wasn't a particularly great actor. Good, solid, undistinguished in some ways Westerns that are going to play to a certain audience. So that then brings me to the best of the bunch. I actually have another Blu-ray of this one, which was the American release, and there it is there, UpTight, the Jules Dassin movie from 1968. But Imprint have put out a much more interesting version of it with a different cover there. And this is something extraordinary. There's the inside cover. Let's see what we've got on the inside. Yep, we've got another production still on the inside. I've actually left the movie in my machine because I'm going to watch it again. When people ask you which remake is better than the original version, you can always throw this one up there because it's a remake of a 1935 John Ford film called The Informer that had Victor McLaglen in it. It was based on a novel by Lamar Flaherty. And Jules Dassin was one of those American directors who fled the House Un-American Activities Committee, went to Europe, and became more successful there. He made The Naked City in America. So Dassin goes over to London, makes Night in the City with Richard Widmark. Fantastic crime film. Then he goes to Paris and makes Rafifi, which is one of the best caper crime films in movie history. He made another movie that I haven't checked out, but I need to, called He Who Must Die. And then he did Never on Sunday and fell in love with his star Milena McCurry. They made some films together. And then in 1968, he came back to America and made UpTight. Now, Dassin was unashamedly a revolution. He was a Communist Party member. He was a lefty. He was unashamedly so, which limited his career in America, but gave him the impetus to make all of those really good movies in Europe. So Dassin got to deal with Paramount Studios to do a remake of The Informer. They kind of had a vague idea of making it about student revolutionaries in America at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in universities around the country where university students weren't putting up with the jive anymore. But he then decided he wanted to make it about black revolutionaries, and some real life historical things came together to make this movie powerful. The murder of Martin Luther King Jr. was a bombshell. So Dassin and his director of photography, Boris Kaufman, went to the funeral of Martin Luther King Jr. and shot footage on the streets. They shot the horse cart, the green horse cart with his coffin in it, that travelled down the streets of Memphis with 150,000 people following it. He shot the reactions of the people at the time to this kind of profound catastrophe. And he started his movie with that. It has documentary footage of the funeral procession of the coffin of Martin Luther King Jr. And now, the other thing he had a problem with is he was a white guy making a movie about black revolutions and black disempowerment in the 1960s. So he's very smart. He went to a fine writer, actor, director called Ossie Davis and suggested that Ossie help him write the script. Ossie was busy. So he said, why don't you get my wife Ruby Dee to do it? And Ruby Dee was a fine actress, a writer, a civil rights leader, fantastic, strong presence in black cinema as it was developing at the time. And Dassin got her on board at a time when women of colour were not given many opportunities to write a screenplay for a major movie studio. The other person they got on board was an American expatriate who just got back from living in Ghana and working for the Ministry of Information in Ghana, a guy called Julius Mayfield, who was a fine writer, an actor, but mostly known for his writing. And they got him on board as well to co-write the script and to star in the movie as the focal character Tank, who is a kind of middle-aged man. He's an alcoholic. He'd been to prison for a short time for beating up some white co-workers at the steel mill where he worked because they were giving other black people shit. He's a broken man, and he is of close friends with Johnny Wells, the leader of a revolutionary group in Cleveland, played by Max Julian from the Mac. And he's supposed to help Johnny and a group of the revolutionaries steal some guns from a storage warehouse. But Tank's too drunk to help them, so they go by themselves. And Johnny accidentally leaves his jacket there because they're running short of people and they're running short of time. And a night watchman dies. Johnny is a man on the run. So Tank, because pretty much everybody in the community knows that Tank and Johnny are friends, Tank is approached by a very well-dressed, elegant black man called Clarence, played by Roscoe Lee Brown, who's a police informant. And Clarence tells him that he can make some money by telling the cops where Johnny is. There's a $1,000 reward. And we see Clarence talking to the cops before this. And Clarence is a kind of brave man in a lot of ways. He tells the cops that, not only is he a black police informant, but he's also gay. He uses the F word for being gay. Roscoe Lee Brown himself being a gay man, he actually got to portray a complex character rather than a stereotype of a gay man. And Tank at first rejects Clarence's offer. He goes and sees an ex-girlfriend of his called Laurie, played by Ruby Dee, who's a single mother who is living on welfare and doing some sex work on the side to raise her 2 kids. She's kind of living in extreme poverty and doesn't want to put up with Tank's alcoholic bullshit. Even though she loves him, she just can't be with him. She can't have him as a part of her life because she just has too much on her shoulders at the time. And so Tank eventually comes around to informing on Johnny with the police. Meanwhile, there is a strong revolutionary group. There are people in there, there are actors in there like Ramis and Jakes, G2 Kumbuka, Robert Dorkey, people who are part of the revolutionary group and who want to make sure that Johnny in some way stays free. Meanwhile, Tank has dobbed him into the coppers. Things progress tragically from there for everybody involved. This is a raw movie. During production of the movie, Bobby Kennedy died as well, and other civil rights leaders died. So it's at that point of American history where things were quite delicate and quite brutal in some ways. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago and all the riots there where the cops came down hard on the protesters. All of that was going on while this movie was in production. It was a powder keg movie made at a powder keg time in American history, which makes it really interesting. And there are some fantastic individual scenes in this one. There's a scene at a fun fair where Tank kind of staggers into while he's drunk, which was totally cut out of TV viewings of this movie in the 1960s and 70s because it was just too political and too raw. And the movie got buried by the studio because Descent had created a fantastic movie that was too at the cutting edge of history for a mainstream Hollywood movie studio to really embrace. And so it got some kind of a release, but it didn't do well because the mirror was held too closely to the face of America. It is a fantastic movie. I've seen it twice now, and each time it bombards me with what it is and when it is, and the incredible strength of the actors. There are whole scenes which are basically arguments against peaceful protests and violent revolution, and which is better and which is worse, and who should be involved in those processes, and who are the gatekeepers, and who get to say, and who gets to be part of whichever path is taken, and to what extent people should go along those paths. There are incredible didactic moments in there where the complexity of the arguments don't involve any answers. There are no answers to the problems this movie raises in the movie. All there are people discussing it and giving all of the different viewpoints, from a Gandhi-like pacifist resistance and following the processes of law through elections and elected representatives to violent revolution. All of these things get an airing, and all these arguments are highlighted with viewpoint characters. It's an incredible movie, and it's not an easy movie, but it is really good. It uses the industrial landscapes around Cleveland, and again, this is one of the movies where Jules Dassin shoots on location because the streets of Cleveland were the way we see them in the movie, and the slum areas in Cleveland and the industrial areas. There are parts of the climax of this movie which parallel the last scenes in Get Carter, way before Get Carter came out. I think that using large-scale industrial machinery as a part of an action climax when someone's being hunted is something that can be used again and again incredibly well, and this movie does that. It's also got some music in it by Booker T and the MGs, including their biggest hit, Time Is Tight. It's a movie of its time. It's a revolutionary movie. It's unashamedly on the side of justice for people who are disenfranchised. And some of the extras even talk about this movie in parallel with the Black Lives Movement and things like that. So a lot of these issues are still there and are still very raw. 1080p high def, based on a 2019 4K scan of the original camera negative. Audio commentary by Elaine Silver and Jim Orsini from 2023. Film critic and writer Christina Newland on UpTight. She does a really good to-the-camera essay about this one. Elective Vicissitudes and the Radical Exiles of Jules Dassin. A video essay by film historian Daniel Kremer from 2023. And that's very good. It gives a great overview of Dassin's career. This is, for me, one of my favourite releases by Imprint over the last year or so. It's a strong film, and it's a tough film. It's not going to be for everybody. There are going to be people who just want escapism, and that's okay. I've got no problem with that. I like escapism as much as anybody, but there are times when a movie just blows your ass off, and this one does. It's a great movie, and it's one that I really appreciate. I like the work of Jules Dassin. I like all of his movies as far back as they go. Coming back to America after being exiled for 2 decades, almost, and making this one was a gutsy move, a really brave move. And the strength of the lived experience of Ruby Dee and Julian Mayfield and a lot of the actors involved in this. The movie was so controversial when it was being made that the FBI had informants on the set and in the cast and in the crew at the time it was being made because they were scared of it. So a movie based on the informer was in its own crew full of informants, which is mind-blowing when you think about it. But you need to have this one. Like all the Imprint ones, it'll play on any player. And yeah, you can get the other one, but it doesn't have anywhere near the extras this one does. And it's not a groovy package like this one. It's an important film, and it will remain so, I think, because it shows a moment in history when people were in such anguish and people were asking the same questions that we're still asking. Australia's Indigenous population is going through a process like this at the moment. There's no violent revolution, but we're looking at changing the Constitution to acknowledge the First Nations of our country in the Constitution. And that's getting a lot of right-wing flack as well. So this one feels closer to me than it would were that not happening. By the way, I'm voting yes to recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution when the referendum comes up at the end of the year. But anyway, that is one you should have. So that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the notification bell. If you really like the video, you can also support the channel at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Thanks to Viavision and Imprint for giving me these movies to review. They are, even Stargate and the Audie Murphy ones are a lot of fun. There's a lot of entertainment there. The Catman of Paris and Bus Riley's Back in Town. And of course UpTight. Talk to the time in which they're made. And even a movie like Bus Riley, which is not the best movie of the 1960s. Tells you something about the time in which it was made, and tells you about the kind of fears and the aspirations of people. But anyway, that's it for this time around. We've got some more stuff coming up later in the week. May do a live stream on Monday morning. I'm just kind of working that out as well. But in the meantime, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some movies that are edgy for their time, even though they were made way in the past. And I'll catch you next time.